Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast. My name is Chris.
And my name is James.
And we're the Formula One Bros.
Just two twins with a love of F1 to share our thoughts on everything in the world of Formula One.
And we are coming to you after a very exciting, not only Monaco Grand Prix, but day of racing.
Yes.
In America, this is like the Memorial Day Sunday is like the greatest weekend in motorsports because we wake up with the Monaco Grand Prix. Almost immediately following is the build up to the Indy 500 and then the Coke 600 later in that evening, which ended up getting rained out and postponed to the next day. But an exciting ending to the Indy 500. Before we get into anything Formula One, lots of crashes, lots of red flags. First of all, we're glad that everybody's okay when Kyle Kirkwood's tire went flying off.
The only thing that got messed up is a pedestrian car's
the
bumper.
car, but I think IndyCar is going to pay for that. The Speedway is going to pay for that. But glad that everybody's okay and all the accidents. Is gutted for Pato O'Ward, who brought out the final red flag. But lots of red flags, lots of cautions at the very end created a last lap shootout between Joseph Newgarden and former Formula One driver Marcus Ericsson.
Yeah, which I'm happy with. I would have to happy with the result either way because Joseph Newgarden got his first Indy 500 win. But I was really hoping Marcus Ericsson would get his second.
Go back to back.
Go back to back. That would be pretty.
First time since Elio Castroneves in 01 and 02.
Yeah, that would have been really exciting, especially for someone who was kind of discarded out of Formula One. That would have been really cool. But yeah, it was really, really exciting. And the Coke 600 yesterday was also a pretty exciting race as well.
Yeah. But we are here for the Monaco Grand Prix. And before we get into our team ratings and our top performers of the weekend, we have to say it looked like a fairly straightforward pedestrian Monaco Grand Prix.
But even still, before we get into like the second half of the race, which was insanity, even still, like before we had what happened, like it was still the start of it was still a very exciting race. It was still very exciting all the way throughout the race.
Yeah. The biggest thing, I think the biggest intrigue is Monaco is always a one-stop strategy. And so we thought going into this, that I think a lot of people thought going into this, that it was going to be put on the soft tires to get traction off the line and then switch over to the hard tires probably around lap 20 to 30 and then just kind of coast to the end. But you had some people starting on hard to go long, some people starting on medium, nobody really touching the softs except for Logan Sargent on a really, really strange strategy in the middle of the race.
Which did not work out,
but we'll get into that in a little bit. But so it was very intriguing tire strategy at the very start. And you had you had a large cat and mouse game between Fernando Alonso and Max Verstappen, which ended up going Max Verstappen's way. Lots of intrigue, but first, the main thing that always sets the pace for the Monaco Grand Prix is qualifying on Sunday. And so we can't talk about a Monaco Grand Prix, qualifying on Saturday, but we cannot talk about a Monaco Grand Prix without talking about qualifying. And I tell you what,
crazy.
It was an epic qualifying session, and I don't think anybody was expecting Max Verstappen to set that pole.
No, and it really looked like Charles was the first person to set provisional pole at the end, and I was like, okay, Charles got it in the bag. And then I saw Fernando going faster, and I was like, okay, yeah, Fernando's going to get pole. Charles will be second. Because when Verstappen was on his lap, his first sector, he was slower than his previous lap. And I was like, well, there's no way he's going to get it out. And then he put in a pretty decent second sector, but his third sector, oh my gosh, he pulled that out of the bag, and it was an extremely impressive qualifying. Every single time I was like, oh my God, Charles on pole. And I waited and I was like, oh my God, Fernando, oh my God. And then Max, I was like, oh my God. It like blew me away. And the time difference between Fernando and Max was just so incredibly small. So absolute mega last sector. It was
Max. Interesting. I was wondering how it was possible that Max Verstappen made up all of that time in the third sector, but I found out that both the Ferraris and the Aston Martins had been slower. Like the sector 3 had been their slowest sector all weekend. And so I think that there may have been a little bit of gamesmanship from Max Verstappen realizing this and maybe not working the tires as hard through the first and second sector and just going for it in the third sector through the swimming, making sure that he had the tires to get through the swimming pool and Rascasse at a fast pace to be able to do that. And I think that really, really helped him, because it did not look like Red Bull was going to have the advantage or as much of an advantage this weekend, because their straight line speed and their DRS effect is incredible, but you don't have any of that advantage in Monaco. So it really looked like this was going to be Ferrari or Aston Martin or even Mercedes weekend to kind of to upset the status quo. And lo and behold, it was Max Verstappen coming out with the win. And
even I did now that my school year is over, I did a series. I did like a wrapping up the the practice sessions in 60 seconds, like FP1 in 60 seconds, FP2, FP3 in 60 seconds after the sessions were over. And I'll probably be able to do that for most of the races over the summer. But anyway, it looked like, it really, really did look like Red Bull wasn't going to be as strong this weekend. Well, half the team was. But it looked like it was going to be Aston Martin or Ferrari's weekend. And, Ferrari did Ferrari, but it really looked like it was going to be one of those two teams and not Red Bull's weekend. So. Yeah. And then it started raining.
Yeah, and so we get through all of that intrigue between qualifying and everything, and then Charles had his grid penalty for impeding Norris, which we now know was just... It was a slam dunk penalty. It was always going to happen. People saying that the FIA are treating Charles poorly did not watch Lando Norris's onboard. Yeah. Because it was very clearly impeding through the tunnel, and it was a slam dunk penalty. It was easy, and it was because Ferrari didn't tell him that he was coming, and so he just didn't know. He was on a cooldown and didn't know that he needed to give that room, and it ruined Lando Norris's lap. But we get through all of that. And then around lap 40, it starts to rain. And at first it was just sprinkles here and there. And then all of a sudden, the middle sector looked like it was a river on the track. And you got to this created some really interesting tire strategy. But even before we get into the tire strategy, it looked like bumper cars. It was something that we had. It reminded me a lot of going back and watching clips from the '96 Monaco Grand Prix. That was I think like 8 cars finished that because of the rain,
something like that. Ridiculous.
And it was just nuts. It reminded me a lot of that. You had so many drivers going off and hitting the barrier, but still being able to continue, some not. It was crazy. And then as soon as it came, it went. Yeah. And it was intermediates to the end of the race. And after all of that, through everything, we ended up a podium with Max Verstappen winning
no surprise there.
Which was not a surprise, but Max Verstappen winning, Fernando Alonso in P2. And
that was his highest finishing position all season so far.
And Esteban Ocon taking his 4th podium, and the first Frenchman to be on the podium in Monaco since that '96 race when Olivier Panis was on the podium there. So super happy for Esteban Ocon.
Yeah, very happy. But overall, my takeaway for the entire race is that was probably one of the most exciting Monaco races that we have witnessed in our lifetime. Like it had everything. It had really good strategy calls, very intriguing strategy calls,
and some poor strategy calls.
There were a couple like overtakes, risky maneuvers, all that kind of stuff. And it rained through in the mix. Overall, it was exciting. Normally in Monaco, I'm like, yay at the start, and then I'll just scrolling on my phone for most of the race. But I was hooked that entire race. And I actually had a friend of mine, a friend of ours, who doesn't really watch Formula One. He was like, I'm watching the Monaco Grand Prix. And at every turn he would text me like, oh my God, this happened. And it was cool because he didn't really know much about Formula One, and just seeing his perspective on it was really cool. But it was really, really exciting, and we really, really got a treat this weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely a great race. And there's always, I feel like in Monaco, there's always a threat for rain. Especially the past couple of years, there's just always kind of been a threat for rain, and it finally happened. It finally rained, and it threw everything it changed everything. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. We'll start with our driver ratings, and let me pull up the constructors standings.
I just had it. Williams.
Yeah, Williams is first. And I have to say this was a pretty poor weekend from Williams.
Yeah, I give them an F.
I give them a D minus. I don't think it's quite as harsh. I think it could have been worse. Yeah. But really, really odd strategy calls. I mean, I can't fault Logan Sargent or really any of the rookies too much, just because Monaco is so hard for rookies. But man, Williams really did not do Logan Sargent any favors, and Alex Albon also struggled. So all in all, I think that the Monaco Grand Prix weekend for them was going to be very frustrating. Of course, Williams is a car that relies on its straight line speed. So at high, at low downforce tracks, coming up like Spa and Monza, and at high down or low downforce tracks like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, they went well. So this was always going to be a weekend in which they struggled, but it was exacerbated by some really poor strategy calls, and then I think they just got the rain wrong as well.
Yeah, it was not a very good weekend for them, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's not a lot to write home about Williams.
Yeah. Up
next is AlphaTauri. I am going to give them a D plus.
Yeah, I'll give him a D.
Because Yuki Tsunoda was doing very, very well up until the brake failure, they had that brake failure. Yeah. And so I don't think Yuki Tsunoda's final finishing place really captures. I don't think it does justice to his performance, and keeping that car on track in slicks in the wet with brake failure is incredibly hard to do, and he did. He kept it out of the wall. He kept it going, and I don't think that his finishing position really reflects it. But all in all, still just a tough weekend for AlphaTauri and another tough weekend for Nick DeVries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I will say, I think Nick DeVries, he has driven Monaco before in F2 and in Formula E, so he has some experience. But still, it's just tough for rookies. This track, I mean, you're at tracks like this and at Singapore, you're gonna see rookies. You're just gonna see rookies at the back of the pack.
Yeah.
And so I think Nick DeVries being there is no surprise.
Yeah.
But
he was
just a tough weekend.
I was about to say he was the highest finishing rookie, but it was actually Oscar Piastri,
which we'll get into them in a little bit.
Yes.
Up next is Alfa Romeo.
I think I'm going to give them a C for this weekend. They had Valtteri finishing 11th and Zhou Guanyu finishing 13th. That car has just been really not good this year. And the fact that they were able to finish there, I think it was it's pretty average as to where that car is and where that team is right now. So I give them a C. Nothing crazy, nothing exciting to write home about. So I'll give them a C.
Yeah, we see this. I agree. It was a good performance for Monaco, but yeah, I think we're starting to see this trend with Alfa Romeo and with Haas both. Of them being a little bit down to where they were compared to last year, and that's the same Ferrari. And this is a trend that I've noticed over the past couple of years, and I think it's because of the way that Ferrari power unit obviously one performs, but two, the way that it's configured and the way that those cars have to configure their setups, but also they have to design their aero around the way that their gearbox and power unit is cased. The performance of those teams fluctuates together. You see when in 2018, when Ferrari had a championship contending car, Haas was doing incredible things. The P4, P5 in Belgium, starting right away in Australia with, they were running P5 and P6 until their double retirement, and then in 2019 or in 2020 and 2021, Ferrari was super down on power, and so were Alfa Romeo, and so were Haas. So you see this trend happening together. So I think Haas and Alfa Romeo this year are a little bit along for the ride, but still, and I actually think that this was a little bit more consistent of a weekend out of Alfa Romeo than we've had the past couple races.
Yeah. Oh,
so
I agree.
I'm almost willing to give them, for where that car is, I'm almost willing to give them a C+ or a B- for where that car is and how they get it. Monaco is a hard track, and being 11th and 13th is not too shabby.
Yeah.
Up next is Haas, and I have to put them right down there with Williams. And honestly, with the way that I'm thinking about giving them an F, just based on the way that they their strategy calls and
having one car DNF.
That's not great, but I think the biggest thing was the drivers, both Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, made a ton of mistakes. They looked like they were rookies out there.
Yeah.
And then the strategy call for them to leave Magnussen, was it Magnussen on the hard or on the slick tires, and then put him on the wets, like that. It didn't really. Nothing that they did this weekend made sense to me. So I'm going to give them an F, just purely because that it just did nothing that they did. It was a very confusing weekend, and Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg did not look like the veterans that they are.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's everything I was going to say.
Yeah, pretty much. Up next is McLaren.
I am going to give them. Let's see, both finished in the points.
Yeah, double points in
9th and
Monaco.
10th. I think I'm gonna give them a B.
I'm gonna give them a B+ because I think where that car started the season to now, and Monaco is a really hard track. But Oscar Piastri being up there in the points, highest placed rookie out of all of the rookies at Monaco, is not an easy thing to do. And scoring points in Monaco in your first year, especially when you drive a tractor, is quite difficult. So I'm going to give them a B+. I think it was a really good weekend, and I think it's also at a track that's not really going to suit the McLarens either. They've had problems at Monaco with their current car philosophy, and I think that is a car that's going to work better at places like Spain, which we have coming up. But all in all, a great weekend, another double points finish for them, which is what they need, and they're they have a couple more good weekends like that, and they could be right up there with Alpine. So
yeah, absolutely, and especially how the season started, finishing how they did in Monaco. Hats off to them, because it was really, really good, and it's good to see them. When McLaren's doing good, F1's always a better place when McLaren's doing good. So
Yep. Cool. And another great weekend for Alpine.
Yeah, I'm giving them an A.
I'm going to give them a B+ because I think Pierre Gasly was a little bit on the back foot and couldn't quite get to Esteban Ocon's level. But Esteban, you have to give a nod to his performance this weekend. I mean, it was sensational, and I think. Not only did he end up on the podium, he put himself in that position because he was always in position to make up for the misfortunes of others, and he was right there when Charles Leclerc got his grid penalty, and he capitalized on it.
Yeah, and it wasn't a podium where he had to capitalize off of the misfortune of others. It was a genuine podium. He beat everyone else purely on pace, and that's not something that we have seen often from Alpine.
Yeah.
So it really was impressive. And even though Pierre Gasly was on the back foot a little bit, I think that's why I'm not giving him an A+. But again, another team where look where they started and look how everyone in that team or around the team was doom and gloom about this season, and then being able to pull off not only a double points finish, but one of your drivers getting on the podium. And it was a genuine podium on merit, not a couple drivers retired.
Yeah.
It's a genuine podium on merit. I think that it's a fantastic weekend for them. So I'm going to give them an A. Had they finished like 1-2 or a double podium, I would give them an A+. But I think that's their performance this weekend is worthy of an A.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we're starting to see cracks a little bit in Pierre Gasly, just because I know he didn't look the most thrilled with his performance, especially compared to Esteban Ocon. So that is going to be something that I'm going to be watching a little bit as we move forward, but still a highly rated driver. I still rate him highly, and I think it was just a tougher weekend for him than it was, but I give Alpine a B+ and first podium of the year for them, and first non-Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, Aston Martin podium of the season. So good for them. Up next is Ferrari, and
I'm probably going to give them I'll probably give them a C- or a D+.
Yeah, I'm going to give them a C-, and I say that because if we look at the whole weekend and not just the race, there were definitely some redeeming qualities about that weekend.
The practice sessions in particular looked pretty positive.
Very promising,
Yeah. And I know they had brought in a couple upgrades for this weekend, which kind of figures they were mainly targeting those upgrades for Imola, but Imola didn't happen. So we saw those. Granted, when you come to Monaco with upgrades, very rarely do you actually see that because it's Monaco. But I think, I think it was a good weekend. It wasn't a great weekend for them, and especially the race was a real downer for them.
Yeah. Had they played the strategy calls right in the race, had Charles had they communicated with Charles in qualifying to avoid the penalty, had they gotten it's just the little things right, the strategy calls, the little things right.
It's reminding me a lot of...
It could have been like an AA+ weekend for them.
Ferrari season this season to me is reminding me of McLaren in 2012 when they had a really strong car. I don't think Ferrari this year is at the level that McLaren was at, because that McLaren should have won the championship. But it's a good car. They're just making just little mistakes. And those little mistakes are starting to really pile up to where it's looking like Ferrari is completely out of the championship. I mean, they don't even have 100 points, and Red Bull is at 249.
Yeah.
So they're so far behind. It's going to take... I mean, they're not going to win it this year. They're not. Ferrari's not going to win it this year. But I think it can look up and improve significantly if they can just get those little tiny issues worked out.
If their upgrades work and they start to do the little things right, given Lance Stroll's performance the past couple weeks and given Mercedes' struggles, I don't see a reason why they can't threaten for second in the Constructors' Championship. I see Aston Martin, Mercedes, and Ferrari all in the same boat. They all have a shot for second, and they all have a shot for fourth.
Yeah.
That's just kind of the way that I see it in terms of speed and pace, and it's just going to take it's going to be the team that gets the little things right. And right now, it's Aston Martin and Mercedes. Aston Martin has 120 points, Mercedes is 119. And they're right there, and they are doing the little things right.
Yeah.
So
I think Yeah, I think Ferrari's trying to shoot for the moon when they need to aim for the clouds first.
Yeah. So there are some redeeming qualities about that weekend, but they just continue to not do things right race day. And I think that is what that's what is causing a lot of these problems. I could go on and on about Ferrari, but we just don't have the time. So up next is Mercedes, and I am going to give them a B+. The only thing that keeps them from giving them an A is George Russell's mistake and his penalty in the race.
Yeah, I would agree. I was going to give him B-. I mean, still, even with George Russell's mistake and with how that transpired, it was still a very good weekend, finishing 4th and 5th in a car that also, much like McLaren at the beginning of the year, everyone was doom and gloom, to the point where they put out a statement to the fans basically apologizing for how crappy the car has been.
It's just the silliest thing.
Which is the stupidest thing ever. Anyway, but with how that car was at the beginning of the season, to get 4th and 5th in Monaco, I think is a really, really strong performance. But I agree. I don't think they're quite worthy of an A, but definitely strong B+.
Yeah, and to be there, and again, you always have to reward the people that take advantage of others' misfortune, and they were there when Ferrari messed up. They were there to take the spoils, and they did, and they were not anywhere near 4th and 5th caliber this weekend, but they put themselves in positions to be there, and you have to reward that. Now,
100%.
They have to talk about. We have to talk about their upgrades, because they did bring a whole new side pod suspension and floor package to this race this weekend. But as you said before with Ferrari, it's impossible to see how well upgrades perform at a track like Monaco.
Yeah, it is.
So it's really for Mercedes and for Ferrari both. It's and Ferrari even has another upgrade coming to Spain.
And I think it's a pretty big one too.
But it's gonna be Spain before we really see how that plays out. But if you come away from Monaco with a 4th and 5th, considering where you started, if I were in that team, I'd be very encouraged. That they were even in a position to take advantage of when Ferrari. And not only that, but when George Russell got his penalty, he was able to keep Charles Leclerc in check with having a greater than 5-second advantage over him. So that was another huge plus that they can check off. Even when they end up in fortunate situations that maybe happened because of luck or the misfortune of others, they can continue to capitalize. And that's what they did. So if I'm in the Mercedes team, I'm encouraged. If I'm a Mercedes fan, I'm encouraged. So much so, starting in Spain, I have Mercedes on my fantasy team. Because they're doing really consistent right now. Lewis Hamilton is I think, seeming to be a little bit more comfortable with the car. George Russell always is always going to be good in a poorly handling car, and has been really good with Mercedes. So, they're, I think, in a really good position, and if they can get these upgrades to work, it'll be really awesome, and I think they can do really well. Speaking of
our annual cannoli sighting, making his
buddy.
appearance.
If you're listening on Spotify, James's cat is now up here on the table where we're filming, and he's enjoying our company, getting some sniffs in. Hey, buddy.
Yeah. Well, that leads us to our next team, which is Aston Martin. I'm going to give them a B- or a C.
I'm going to give them a C- because I think
I'm
the
gonna
way
give them
that
C.
Fernando Alonso, did really well, and he's second, and at some point Max Verstappen is going to make a mistake, and he is going to win a Grand Prix. It's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
It's going to happen in 2023. I think Fernando Alonso is going to win a Grand Prix. But Lance Stroll just, I don't. It just. It was just a tale of two different weekends.
I know
for Aston Martin.
And you look on paper and like, oh well, he DNF'd, so it can't, you can't put him down too much. But all up until he DNF'd, like it was just mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake in the race. He just could not keep himself out of either hitting other drivers, hitting the wall. Like, it was just not a good weekend for Lance Stroll as a whole throughout the entire weekend. It just was not a good weekend for him. But Fernando, on the other side of the spectrum, it was a fantastic weekend for him.
And the reason why I give them a C+ instead of a B-, too, is because there was a strategy call, and that I think had Fernando Alonso's strategy was really perplexing, because Fernando Alonso was on hards, was going long, pitted for mediums 4 laps before the rain came. And so, and
I think it was right after it had started.
Yeah,
raining.
the way that Max Verstappen's strategy ended up working out, I think there was a non-zero possibility that had Aston Martin played the strategy right, kept him on the hard tires, and then put him on the intermediates, I think there is a sniff of a possibility that Fernando Alonso could have jumped Max Verstappen in the strategy and won that race. So I think, yes, is a P2 really, really good? Absolutely. You know, it ties that team's highest, as Aston Martin, that team's highest finishing position. But I just think that there's an element of what could have been for them as well. So
yeah, I think everyone left that weekend or watching that race and thinking, gosh, what if?
What if they had not pit Fernando Alonso?
I even saw that meme. It was like a picture of the utopian future, and it says society in the future if Fernando Alonso had pit for intermediates instead of mediums. And
I just think that it would have been I just think that it would have been better. And I think he could have. It's not a guarantee. It's not a slam dunk, because Max Verstappen and Red Bull, when they have their backs against the wall, are just capable of incredible things. But what could have been? And speaking of another team that it was a tale of two weekends, Red Bull as well. I think Max Verstappen drove a lot more, almost flawlessly.
Yeah, I will say though, as looking at the weekend as a whole, we took a look at Aston Martin as a weekend as a whole. Fernando, the entire weekend was awesome. Lance Stroll, the entire weekend, not awesome. You look at Red Bull, and here's why I'm going to give them a B-, because as a whole, for the entire weekend, Checo's only mistake was during qualifying. Now, he wasn't able to work his way through the pack as I had hoped that he would. And I think everyone kind of maybe expected. But as a whole, for the entire weekend, Checo was still really, really strong up until his mistake in qualifying.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm going to give him a B- instead of comparing to Aston Martin's C.
Yeah, I'm gonna give them a B- as well. Obviously, Max Verstappen did really well. They did look a little bit on the back foot, but and you did have Sergio Perez's mistake, and a mistake in qualifying is much more costly than a mistake in the race. So I think that, and I definitely know, and you could tell in his post-race interviews that. His post-qualifying interviews and his post-race interviews, that his qualifying mistake was still lingering very heavily on his mind.
Yeah.
And I think that Monaco is hard to overtake. It's near impossible to overtake, so he was always going to have a very, very hard Sunday. But and I think he did do well, all things considered. I think he did okay, but getting lapped twice by your teammate is not a great thing.
Yeah.
But all in all, I think the performance, we know where the performance of that car is. And I think, again, had Sergio Perez not made that mistake, bless you, had he not made that mistake, I think that could have been a double podium for Red Bull.
I totally agree. Well, next we will go on to our top performer of the week. I'll let you go first.
I think I know who you're gonna say, so I'm not gonna say it.
Well,
and I'm gonna
say who you're gonna say.
I obviously have to give it to Esteban Ocon, and I think the P4 in qualifying, which ended up becoming a P3. He had the measure of Pierre Gasly the whole weekend. His first podium of the season, his fourth in Formula One, first Frenchman on the podium in Monaco since 1996. That is incredible. And so I think I voted for him driver of the day, and he ended up being driver of the day. And so I think my top performer is Esteban Ocon.
I'm going to do something controversial here. I'm going to pick the exact same person. I mean, that his performance throughout really the whole weekend, because he was strong throughout the weekend, qualifying and in the race. How can you not pick him? Like it was incredible. There were no mistakes from him and the team. So I too am going to pick Esteban Ocon.
If I had to pick somebody else, I'm going to pick Lewis Hamilton.
Yes,
because P4 in that. But what's better than that is he was able to keep up with the Ferraris and Esteban Ocon in the Alpine, and it was almost like no matter what was happening with the top 5 or 6 drivers, he was always there in the mix and always threatening. And you kind of get this sense whenever Lewis Hamilton is in that situation that there's always a possibility that he can come through and do something amazing. So I also have to give it to Lewis Hamilton. I think if I'm going to pick somebody other than Esteban Ocon, I'm going to give it to Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah. But
which I think is the first time since we've been doing this segment that I've picked a Mercedes driver.
Yeah. Well, that's all for Monaco. What's exciting though is this weekend we have Spain, and a lot to look forward to in Spain. A lot of teams are bringing upgrades. Teams usually target Spain for upgrades because they didn't do it this year, but at least at some point during the winter season they have done winter testing at Spain. It's it's a good racetrack that has all types of parts of the racetrack that fit all different needs for the cars. So it's further enough. It's far enough into the season so all the teams can kind of get a feel of what they need in their cars. So a lot of teams usually bring upgrades to Spain anyway, but this year especially a ton of teams. I want to say 60%. I want to say 6 out of the 10 teams are bringing upgrades to Spain. Maybe even more are bringing upgrades to Spain. And a couple of them are bringing pretty massive upgrades. Like Ferrari's upgrades are pretty massive. I think Mercedes and Aston Martin upgrades are pretty big too. Red Bull's bringing some upgrades. I think McLaren's bringing some upgrades too. I think McLaren's upgrades are going to also be pretty big. So a lot of teams bringing upgrades to Spain. That's the one thing that we can look forward to. The second thing to look forward to.
Well, before we get to this, I want to add something.
I'm just so excited
because what you're talking about, I know what you're going to say, and it's very exciting. But I will say this is the first time in a while that we haven't had a winter testing session at Spain, and so those winter testing sessions that happen in Spain, there's so much data collection that happens that the Spanish Grand Prix ends up being a little boring.
Yeah.
And of course, there is going to be a little bit carryover data from last year because the car regulations didn't change at all. But a lot of the teams have completely different aero philosophies from what they rolled up to in Spain. I'm thinking Williams, Aston Martin, Alfa Romeo, Haas, McLaren, a little bit. Who else? Did I say Mercedes? So almost none of the teams have the same vehicle philosophy that they did.
Really, it's just Ferrari and Red Bull. haven't made super crazy changes from the Spanish Grand Prix last year.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of teams that there is a little bit, but some of that data informed a lot of the upgrades and the differences in philosophy that we see now. But still, not having those 3 days of running at that track before testing might do something. I don't think it's going to be very significant, but it might do something.
Yeah.
Because this is the first time in a long time that we haven't had winter testing in Barcelona.
Yeah.
So
that's the second thing that might make it exciting. The third thing I'm most excited
oh my God,
about.
I'm so happy.
The third sector.
It makes me so happy.
That final chicane section they're taking out. They're going back to the old layout of the track. The second to the penultimate corner will finally just be probably just a flat right-hand corner. I'm so looking forwed to that.
Makes me so
I'm also looking forward to that because it's going to be that way in the F123 video game. But I'm so looking forward to that. I think it'll actually make for good racing now.
Yeah.
It'll be exciting. It'll be good.
I can't wait.
Yeah, very, very happy about that.
Long overdue, in my opinion.
Yes, long overdue. I think it'll.
Cannot wait.
Yeah, which means a lot. Those drivers are going to be carrying a ton of speed going into that first corner.
Yeah,
which is also really exciting too.
A ton of speed in the first corner, but also you get into these situations with these cars being able to follow closer than previous generations of F1 cars. That third sector is not going to be there to break up the racing. So I think those two things in combination will create some really interesting passing opportunities down the front straightaway. Very similar to, I think, Portimao and Mugello. I think those are going to be really interesting. Yeah. That's going to be a really interesting setup. Yeah. So I'm so excited. I cannot wait to see how that's going to go.
Yeah, and we don't have to wait too much longer for it.
Nope.
Just a few more days.
Because race day cars are back on track in just a few days. Today is Tuesday. So in 3 days, cars are back on track again. So lots to look forward to. Our next episode will be after the Spanish Grand Prix in 1 week's time.
Yep.
Look forward to seeing or hearing you having you join us either by audio or by video.
Be sure
at that time.
Yep, and be sure to follow us on all of our social channels: TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, all that kind of stuff. The link is in our bio, both on YouTube and on TikTok. So be sure to like and subscribe, follow along, and let us know down in the comments what your thoughts are for the Monaco Grand Prix. And we look forward to joining you next time.